Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this second of these exciting series on environmental education with Dr. Tom English. I'd like to welcome you all to this set of sessions that we've been having. We started last week with environmental perspectives, and today we're going to be reviewing life past, present, and future. And so Tom, as many of you know, has an unusual ability to communicate difficult concepts in very easy to understand ways. And this is one of the things I love the most about Dr. English. He has a huge passion for educating others on our current climate crisis and the existential threats that it's bringing to us and to our children's generations. And we all need to be more aware of what can be done to counter this. And frankly, that's the purpose of this series, so that we can help better educate our friends and family. My name is Dave Rice, and I'll be your host for this event. Enjoy this presentation, and it's my pleasure to now introduce Dr. Tom English.
Thanks, Dave. Well, good to see you all. Today we're going to look at a kind of ambitious thing, look at life, which is really interesting, in the deep past of life in the present, and life in the future. The reason we're doing that is to get some idea of how interesting our times are. I had a Chinese boss in my working with General Electric, and one of the things he would do is he would teach me Chinese curses. So he claimed that the most interesting Chinese curse was, "May you live in interesting times." So we certainly are living in an interesting era. It's probably the most interesting ever in the history of humanity. We're powerful enough to change the entire planet. So we have to make sure when we do that, we don't make it difficult for our fellow species to continue living, or make sure we don't rob the gifts of diversity from our kids. So we're going to look at a so-called win-win path through these current dilemmas so we can solve the problem, but do it in a way that really increases our quality of life. So here's our roadmap for today. We're basically going to look at the past and some basics of life on Earth. We'll look at the present, how are we doing? And we'll look at the future. So that's it. We'll have these three parts to our talk. Start with the past and the basics. Basically, life on the planet got started pretty soon. The Earth, the sun got started about a little bit over 4 billion years ago. The Earth got started a little bit later. And it was kind of hot. And what happened is a Mars-sized planet hit the Earth and basically melted the surface of the Earth. And it caused all kind of rubble to go into space. And a lot of that rubble collected to form this thing that we have, the moon. So that's where the moon came from. And what happened is the planet then cooled down. And at about 4 billion years ago, the planet was cool enough where it was possible for life to form on the planet. And so there, a tenth of a billion years later, which is a very short time geologically, the first living cell occurred. Now, when I was in high school, I had a course in biology, and they explained to me that a cell contains 3 pieces. There's a cell wall, there's a nucleus, and some stuff in between called protoplasm. And I thought, that's pretty dull, having only just those 3 components. So what happens is they've learned a few things since my high school days, and they now consider even the most simple cell as more complex than a large city like New York City. So there's a lot of complexity there that had to occur in a very short period of time, and you wonder how that could all happen. Then what happens is time passes, and that single-celled kind of thing becomes a cell with a nucleus later. About 2.5 billion years ago. So it took 1.4 billion years to go from having no nucleus to a nucleus. That's an enormous period of time. And that was a lucky break for us, because what happened then, that was with the cell with the nucleus, was the invention of sex. And sex allows us to essentially mutate much more rapidly than we could without sex. And so change becomes possible because planets don't have an infinite lifetime. So if we're going to have some interesting things going on the planet, you want to make sure that there's enough mutation rate in order for that to happen. We've got the first photosynthetic cells. These are cells that basically are able to take in sunlight and give off oxygen at about 3.5 billion years ago. So what happened is that those cells started to reproduce and give off oxygen, but there was no oxygen in the atmosphere until about 2.5 billion years. It took a long time because the oxygen that came out was absorbed by the rocks and by the water. And so it took a long time before that stuff finally went into the atmosphere. And then you can see the cell with the nucleus comes about 500 million years after the oxygen starts in the atmosphere. So that helped to produce these so-called eukaryotes. And then things got kind of busy at about 1 billion years ago. We got bacteria created, protozoas, various kinds of sponges, corals. And then about 600 million years ago, there was a wild explosion of life called the Cambrian explosion. It's named for a place where they found these fossils in Cambria in England. And there's big things started to appear all over the planet, things that would be this very big enough so that if you were swimming with them, they might consider you an opportunity for lunch. So very, very big, very complicated. All this stuff occurred in a very short period of time. And we really don't quite understand what happened there. But it's a very amazing thing to see this Cambrian explosion. So life appears all of a sudden. This critter over here on the side here is called a chitin. It's something that appeared during that time. And these things are still, they're still available. They're still living. So you can go to SeaWorld and there's a fish tank there that has some chitins on the side of it. So these things have been around for all 400 million years. So really old critters. So as life evolved, what happened is it didn't follow a very much of a straight line path. It basically started in a big way about 600 million years ago, and then this Cambrian explosion occurred till about maybe 500 million years ago. And then what happened is things leveled off. In fact, then they started to drop all of a sudden. So this first thing is a drop where you lose half of the plant and animal species on the planet. And that's a big deal when that happens. So the whole ecosystem gets changed. And when that happens, that's called a mass extinction. So the first mass extinction occurs here right at about 450 million years ago. Then things recover. What happens is after an ecosystem is half destroyed, it basically, there's a lot of things in the ecosystem that are no longer functioning. So this makes for ecological niches that aren't full. So the critters that are there start to modify themselves so they can fit into those niches. And the modifications become big enough that they become a different species. That means they couldn't mate with what they were before. So that's a way of generating a lot of new species. And that's called a radiative explosion, where it's like an explosion of life. And that takes a long period of time. Then things kind of come up here, kind of wobble around for a while, settle out. And then there's a second loss of half of all the animal and plant species, the second mass extinction. So once again, there's a radiative explosion of life. And then there comes to be a third mass extinction. This one here almost lost the whole ballgame. Above 95% of the plant and animal species on the planet went extinct on that one. So it was a close call. And then it recovered again rapidly. When I say rapidly, I'm talking 10, 20 million years. And then it went down again, another mass extinction. And it went up quite a bit. And what happened here is an interesting thing. A big rock from space came and basically wiped out the species that are there. So during the first episode here, the species that was predominant on the planet they're called trilobites. Like this is a lobe, this is a lobe, this is a lobe. So there are 3 lobes to a trilobite. Now you can buy these things in novelty stores for about $1 each. The ones that you can get there are about thumb size, but there are much bigger ones available if you have a big, thick wallet. So this is the first age, the age of the trilobites, followed by the age of Barney and the other dinosaurs. And then that age is followed by the age of little mice and little critters like us, so mammals. So those are the various ages that we have. So it's interesting that most of the change to life that has occurred in this period of 600 million years is not caused by the so-called survival of the fittest. It's caused by the recovery of these species that happen to recover quickly. So life is basically not due to the slow, methodical, Darwinian kind of thing, but it's due to some wild filling of the ecosystems after each of the mass extinctions. That accounts for like 99% of all the life. This gives you a little bit more detail of what happened during the extinction that did in the dinosaurs, the so-called extinction number 5. A big rock from space, about the size of the Himalayan mountains, about 6 miles in diameter, hit the Earth near Cancun, in fact, near Club Med in Cancun, and made a big hole in the surface of the Earth, about 150 miles across, melted everything in there, cast all kinds of rocks into space. So these rocks were melted, they went into space, and they basically orbited the whole planet. And what this did is it caused the forests all over the planet to catch on fire. So all of a sudden you had forest fires over the whole world. An incredible phenomena in a very short period of time. This is what the atmosphere of the Earth looks like from space. This real thin little blue layer here. It's on a relative scale, it's about as thick as the skin of an apple. So you have this very little skin of atmosphere around the planet, and this is what allows for the life on the planet. Mass extinctions, number 2, 3, and 4, were primarily due to things that happened to destroy the atmosphere, basically from geological processes. We don't know what happened to number 1 yet. The scientists are still working on that one. And number 5, we just showed you, was due to a rock from space that hit. If you want to see what the craters look like whenever that kind of thing occurs, you can go over to Arizona. There's a Winslow, Arizona. There's a big crater there, not nearly as big as the one that did in the dinosaurs, but it's supposed to be the most perfect looking crater on Earth. Now, mass extinction number 6, the one that we're possibly into now, is also due to a combination of the destruction of the atmosphere and also the destruction of our tropical rainforest. And we'll go into some more detail about that later. So basically, mass extinction recovery times, this is Jay Gould in his book, The Book of Life. It says it takes about 10 million years for the fauna to recover. Reefs took a little bit slower, about 20 million years. And E.O. Wilson says the complete recovery from these 5 major extinctions takes the order of tens of millions of years. So basically, they're both in agreement that these recovery times are on a scale of 1 million years. So if we go through a mass extinction, we can't like say, gee whiz, we're sorry, we'll fix it this weekend. It's not going to be fixed very quickly. It's going to take a scale of 10 to 20 million years. So when I was with the Lung Association, I was the vice president of the Pasadena Lung Association. They like to attribute a lot of problems with lungs due to people smoking. So we made the joke that they would think that basically cigarettes also did end the dinosaurs. So some of the students, whenever they saw this slide, they would say, well, how could the dinosaurs possibly roll cigarettes? And the stock answer in those days was they had to do it very carefully. So let's do some math that basically explains this whole series of extinctions in a way that's simplified. So you all know about chickens having eggs, okay? Pretty simple. So if we say that chickens have so many eggs a month, and we multiply by so many months, that gives us how many eggs a given chicken creates per month. So that gives us an idea of how productive they are. Now, we do something with the eggs. We eat them, for example. So if we know the eating rate of eggs and the time that we're eating them over, that's the number of eggs that go extinct. So if we're counting the net gain in eggs, we take the eggs created minus the eggs eaten, and we get the eggs stored. So eggs created minus eggs eaten or extinct, eggs stored. So that's the beginning of the math. Now we can do the same thing for species. We can say the species created, creation rate times the time, extinction, species gone extinct, extinction rate times the time, subtract the ones that are extinct from the ones created, and you get the number of species alive. And that turns out to be about 1.4 million species. That's the number that we have on the books. These are numbers that the species counter have entered into the scientific records. There may be more species than that, but these are the ones we know about. And so this talk is based on the stuff that we know about as opposed to just making some guesses about the things we don't know about. We also believe that that most of the species that are created have gone extinct. So anyway, what this basically says is about 99% of all species that have ever lived are extinct. So extinction is a normal part of the life cycle for the planet Earth. You don't want to be around whenever the big extinctions are occurring, though, because it'd be kind of messy. And this we know this equation, that equation, and the time is 600 million years. So you put that all together, and you come up with that the species have gone extinct, roughly one species in 4 years over the last 600 million years. So it takes about 4 years for a species on the average to go extinct. So that gives you some idea of a simplified analysis of it. So this cartoon kind of summarizes what we know. This is a cartoon by Larson. I love his stuff, Extinct and Loving It. 99% of all species are extinct, and we have 1.4 million species, and the extinction rate is normally one species in 4 years. So that gives you kind of a hand on how life has functioned at a higher level for the last 600 million years. Now let's look at it on a lower level. Suppose we try to get a hand on an ecosystem. Let's make up an ecosystem that'll be basically some bugs in a jar. So we put these little bacteria, let's say, in a jar, and we put some sort of fluid around them so that they're happy. So you basically have these happy bugs in a jar with the right temperature, the right nutrients, the right everything you can think of. And so what that does is leads to more bugs. So we get more bugs with time. So we get a little scientific here and have a graph that says number of bugs versus time. So what happens is the bugs increase and increase and increase. So if you were at a point in time where maybe there was a bug that worked for the bug Wall Street Journal, he would predict the future. He would say, well, this has always been great, so we'll basically assume the future is just like the past. And so there's our prediction. Looks pretty good to me. But what happens in these ecosystems is as you get more and more of the bugs in the jar, they start to interfere with the world around them. And so instead of the bugs just going straight up and just until the sky reaches, or the trees reach the sky, it bends over at some point. And you basically have a mass die-off in the system. These die-offs can go all the way to zero where everything dies, or they can go to a small level and then have a partial recovery. But this is one way to look at an ecosystem in terms of bugs in a jar. So if things die off, you get these unhappy bugs here left, if there's any left. And so if a system is seriously depleted, recovery may be difficult or it may be impossible. So that's why we want to make sure we don't deplete our system too much. So this is our jar. This is the jar that we live in. And you wonder how many of us the jar can take. So we're time for questions. Okay, Dave, take over. Okay,
Overall, how does the rate of species extinction compare with the rate of species creation?
great question. Yeah, that's a good one. The basic thing that you got to remember is that if the rate of extinction was on the average greater than the rate of creation, you would have everything dying off. So just regularly, you would have the number of species on the planet would get smaller and smaller. But when you look at that record, even though there are lots of bumps in the curve, the 5 major bumps for those mass extinctions, you see that the net number of species is getting larger and larger. And so what happens is, as of now, the creation rate is about 1% higher than the extinction rate. So that's why it's going up.
Okay, very good. And then another question is, why is it that scientists don't understand the cause of the first mass extinction?
Hey, that's a good question too. Whenever I was in high school, they didn't understand the cause of any of the extinctions. In fact, whenever I was in college, they didn't even know that the third mass extinction, which was the big one, the so-called the end Permian extinction, they didn't even know that that had occurred. So what's happened is they just weren't looking for these things. So they started looking more and more, and as they looked more and more, they found more and more detail. So that's the record got filled in. So it's an interesting thing, but they haven't been yet. I guess the concept that the extinctions 2, 3, and 4 were due to problems in the atmosphere caused by volcanoes, essentially belching for thousands of years. They basically didn't know that until maybe 15, 20 years ago. So we're still learning, and it's I guess that's what keeps these science types employed.
Exactly. We've had a couple actually in the chat. Let me just real quick ask you. So are you counting viruses and bacteria as separate species or only more complex organisms?
This is basically looking at the more complex organisms.
Okay.
That's an area where we're just starting to learn how to do it, and the numbers would be staggering.
Right. Okay. And then finally, why did the Earth cool down after the collision with the other planet?
Well, what happens is the second law of thermodynamics prevails. Things that are hot, if they're next to things that are colder, will basically cool down. So you have this hot planet, and you have all of space, which is at a pretty low temperature. So it just radiates down. But it took a long time, many millions and millions of years, for it to get to a place where life was possible. So it took perhaps, let's say roughly about 400 million years or so for it to get to the place where life would be possible. Then life all of a sudden sprung in, all of a sudden. So that's a big question. Is life something that just springs up anywhere you can, where the temperatures, et cetera, are right? Or is it really pretty rare? That's why they're landing this thing on Mars this afternoon to take a look at that question to see if there is indeed any hint of life on Mars. My expectation is life is going to be pretty darn rare. And so we better take care of the place that we have here. Okay, well, thanks for your questions. Let's move on to the present. So this is an interesting diagram here. It's sort of a speciescape. And what it shows is that by the size of the species, roughly how many there are. Like, for example, this big thing here, this butterfly, is an example of an insect. And so if you look at the chart and look at the numbers, it turns out that about half of all the species on the planet are insects. So they're very, very important. Whereas if we look over here, we see a species, well, we have 1.4 million species. So now if you look over here, what you see is a little purplish wolf, okay? This is an example of a mammal. And there are only about 4,000 or so mammal species. So very few mammals compared to insects. Although the mammals are very important because we're one of them. So this gives you a feeling for the complexity of the kind of ecosystem that we have. What's happened is, and various species have had a tough time over the years. The bald eagles are estimated around the time of the American Revolution in the lower 48 states to be roughly 100,000 pairs of nesting bald eagles. Whereas in 1963, that number got down to a little bit less than 500. And people got upset about that and basically tried to figure out what was going on and how to solve the problem. A lot of it involved DDT. So what happened is we basically have had some partial recovery here. By 2014, we're up to 14,000 species. So we haven't quite got nearly as many as we used to, but we're doing a lot better than 487. So this is called a environmental success story. Similar thing with the gray whales. We used to have about 100,000 of these whales coming from Alaska and going down to Baja every year. And people noticed that they were pretty slow and easy targets. So they went out and basically captured these whales and slaughtered them for their blubber and oil. So they dropped from about 100,000 to the scale of around 500 or so. Then people such as you got angry about this and basically started to put pressure on the political system to protect these whales. And they're now back to numbers like you see here in 1994, around 20,000, and it's about 7,000 or so now. So great improvement, but it would still be nice to see more of them. So another environmental success story. This is a sea otter. Some of you may have seen those in the Monterey Bay area, sort of floating and pounding on some sort of seashell on their chest. At the time of whenever the Russians came to this country, they were a very, very valuable species. The pelt of one sea otter was worth with 2 years of wages for one seaman. So that's a lot of money. So the Russians decided to come over here and get rich. And so they came over and slaughtered as many of those things as they could. They even built a fort here, the so-called Fort Ross, established in 1812, when they were having a little bit of a problem with Napoleon, to basically protect the fur trade with these sea otters. But they had slaughtered too many, and they basically couldn't make any money after that, and so they ended up leaving. I went through this museum here, and it's kind of funny. You see things where the people used to sleep, and you'll see like carved on the wood of the wall, you'll see something like a heart, and it'll say, Ivan loves Katrina. So very interesting time there. So what's happening in general is a lot of species are threatened with extinction. Remember we said before that a normal concept would be that you'd roughly have one species going extinct in about 4 years. This one here says that this is from the International Union of the Conservation of Nature. This says that about 14% of the birds worldwide are threatened with extinction, about 26% of the mammals, about 34% of the reptiles, and about 40% of the amphibians are threatened with extinction. So we have an incredible extinction phenomena going on here, which could be the beginning of the Earth's 6th great mass extinction. And we'll get into some more details on that later. Same kind of thing goes for the oceans. As the population of marine vertebrates declined about 50% from 1970 to 2012. So we're seeing this extinction really all over the place, and it can't go on for too much longer. Here are some of the things that we see around us that kind of make us worry about what are we doing to the weather. This is a kind of a storm in Phoenix, Arizona. This is a phenomena where it's like a burst of water coming from the sky. It looks like something out of a science fiction movie, but essentially buckets full of water are coming down in a short period of time in a wide area, scaring everyone within there. Very frightening phenomenon. And we're seeing all sorts of rainforest problems and all over the world. we'll be going into the burning of forest in more details and some of these atmospheric phenomena in more details next week in the talk. It's called, I think appropriately enough, Weird Weather. So Darwin wrote his book, The Origin of the Species. It's a good book. I thoroughly enjoy it. There's a sequel proposed here to it, The Termination of the Species, Volume 2. So that would be the end of the series. So people were starting to worry a lot about the rate of extinction of species. This is a cartoon. There was a guy by the name of Dr. E.O. Wilson. He's one of the leading people in terms of understanding plant life or animal life on the planet. His expertise is really in ants. Anyway, he was coming to Scripps Institution of Oceanography to receive the first annual Nuremberg Award, which I think is something like $50,000 and a medal. So after he gave his talk, I went up to him and said, Dr. Wilson, I'd like to present you with this summary of your speech. And he looked at it, and basically it shows people coming into this funnel, polar bears coming into the funnel, orca whales, trees, eagles, etc., elephants. And the big question mark is what's going to come out of this funnel in the 21st century? So when he looked at this, he started crying. And he said, do you realize this summarizes my whole book? So I thought that was a really nice comment for him to make. So here we are, second period of questions. Do we have any questions this time, Dave?
Here's a question. Why don't you include nuclear war as a cause of the 6th mass extinction?
Well, certainly we have learned that when nukes go off, like in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it can make a wreck of the place and kill a lot of people and destroy a lot of area. And those were small nukes, the order of 12 kilotons, 18 kilotons, something like that. So the ones we have now, the typical ones are about 250 kilotons. Those are top typical small nukes today. And we've had, I think the Russians had exploded one that was 20 megatons. So we have a lot of firepower. We have way more firepower than you could ever imagine comparing with World War II, for example. So yeah, the nuclear thing is a big problem. I just didn't want to distract from the biological problem, from the things that we cause with our routine behavior, because I think nuclear war would be a really non-routine kind of behavior. You can't do that very often and survive. So yeah, I think a more complete analysis would include that, but hopefully we never will get to that. The churches have been involved in stopping nuclear war. I gave a lot of speeches back in the 70s, basically to halt the nuclear arms race. We had a big event in Pasadena when I was working with the Synod of Southern California and Hawaii, where we brought in over 100,000 people into the Rose Bowl. And that's when we we had something like 50,000 nuclear weapons on each side aimed at each other. And we've been able to reduce that to a little bit over 1,000 now. So that's progress. I'd like to see us go a lot further though.
Bet.
Great question, Dave.
And then Adrian asked, did other species benefit from how we helped the bald eagles?
What happens is whenever you fix things up for one species, it usually doesn't, it usually helps the other species. For example, in the case of the Yellowstone National Park, what they did there is the park was getting wrecked by essentially having too many elk. It didn't, they didn't have any natural predators for the elk. The wolves were basically hunted to where there were very few wolves left. And so you'd go see all these trees there. And if you looked at a tree closely, you'd see some fuzz from the antlers of the elk for rubbing their horns against the tree. So they were harming the trees and so forth. And so there was just a proliferation of elk. So what they did is they allowed the wolf population to grow somewhat. because they found out that a lot of the people who would go to Yellowstone would go there to see the wolves. So the locals like more and more people going into the motels, so they supported that. So what they did is they brought in maybe tripled, quadrupled the number of wolves, and the elk population went way down. The streams started to recover. The beaver came back. Trees that hadn't been seen for 50 years started to appear. So the whole ecosystem is blooming there. So yeah, so whenever you fix up one species, what happens is the other species benefit. Similarly, whenever you do in one species, it's harmful to the rest of the species. And we'll get into that in more detail later.
Excellent. And then just one comment, Margaret, who's coming to us from just outside Philadelphia and has a couple of baby bald eagles on her street that are there, which is pretty exciting, says that she met E.O. Wilson at an event with the American Humanist Association, dedicated a picnic to him, and he sent a lovely letter back, and that the diversity of life that he wrote is just one of her favorite books, called The Diversity of Life.
Oh yeah, it's a great book. When I taught my first course in basically Extinction of Species at Santa Clara University, that was the textbook we used. Mm. And I got to know Wilson a little bit. In fact, whenever he brought his book out on the future of life, he sent me a copy to review in order to fix it before it went into the final press. So it was I was kind of like a legend in Scripps for a little bit, because people were saying, Tom knows E.O. Wilson.
That's so cool. And then Robert just mentions that there's the art film, The Anthropocene.
Yes.
It's also excellent.
Yeah, the anthropos in Greek means man, okay? And scene is like an era, a geological era. So basically what they've done is they've basically changed the name of the current area. That hasn't formally been done, but it's sort of been done, from what it was before the Holocene to now it's called the Anthropocene, because we are the man is the biggest, what should we call it, biological and geological force on the planet today. So this what's happening on the planet today is very much due to us. Okay, let's get out the foggy crystal balls and talk about the future. This is a slide that was put together back in 1990, basically making an estimate of the percentage of tropical rainforest that would be available over time. The basic content of the slide was that we had a certain number of square kilometers there, about 7.7 million square kilometers for the planet. And the experts were saying that the rate of decrease was somewhere between 1% and 3%. So I like to do sort of average science. So I said 3%, 1%, let's take 2%. So if we basically lose 2% per year, what happens in 1 year, it goes from 100 on this scale to 98. And if we go to 50 years, 2% times 50 is 100%. And so by 2040, this would predict that we would be essentially out of tropical rainforest. So that's interesting. So it's kind of a very sparsely populated data set. So if Jan asked me to update the slides, I says, yes, ma'am, because if you don't say that to your wife, you're in trouble. So this basically, she came up with this slide with about 18 additional years to add to the losses of tropical rainforest. And if you include that data, what happens is you get a curve that looks slightly different than the curve that I had before, the red curve. You get the gray curve. And so basically this argues that the data, that the analysis done in 1990 is off by about 7 years or so. The final extinction of the tropical rainforest ends somewhere around 2047 as opposed to 2040. So pretty good. So why should we be concerned with the tropical rainforest? Well, it turns out that more than half of all species on the planet live in the tropical rainforest. So that's a place with a lot of species. And then it also turns out that more than half of the species in the tropical rainforest only live in the tropical rainforest. I mean, they don't live anywhere else. And so a half of a half gives you a fourth. So if you drive the land available to these species down to zero, what happens is you don't have a home for a quarter of the plant and animal species on the earth. And so this simple phenomena of destroying tropical rainforest can eliminate 25% of all the plant and animal species on the planet. So it's a very, very key thing for us to keep in mind. And I'll show you the details why. Also, we find out that species move around if the temperature changes. And some species don't make the move very well, they die off. And so there was an article in Nature back in 2004 examining this, where Thomas and about 18 other famous scientists wrote this article that made the cover of Nature magazine. Now, if you get an article in Nature, that's a big deal, and people talk about that. But if you make the cover of Nature, your career is made. So it's a big deal if you make the cover. So what they found out, they took a sample of over 1,000 plant and animal species. They did land species, and they found out that somewhere between 15 and 37% of the sample would become extinct by 2050. That's pretty soon. So let's say that on the average is halfway between 15 and 37, that's 25%. So what this says is that 25% of all the plant and animal species are going to be extinct by 2050, just as a result of normal climate change. Right in the middle, not the extreme values, right in the middle values. So I presented this data to a bunch of people, Congressman, Senator Boxer, and Senator Feinstein, two I remember, and they were shocked by this, and it made a big difference in their policy. So if you got 25% being done in by the heat and 25% being done in by the tropical rainforest in a fairly short period of time, like 2050, you have a problem. So we're currently doing in something like about 8,000 species a year. And this number turns out to be fairly conservative. That would be roughly one species an hour. So if we compare that current extinction rate with, remember the number we talked about earlier, the background extinction rate, one species in 4 years. We're currently doing in species at a rate of 32,000 times faster than the planet is used to. So we're aiming towards a mass extinction somewhere 2050, somewhere between that and the end of the century. So this is a very serious problem. So in the 21st century, if we don't change our ways, half of all the species in the planet will be extinct. This is the 6th extinction book by Elizabeth Colbert. The nice thing about her book is that she is not only technically right, but she is a good writer. So you will enjoy reading the book. Let's look at a typical food web to see how this stuff works. Here we have a seal at the top of the food chain. And this seal eats the things that are below it, the so-called first trophic level. And so what happens is that's its food supply. And then these things eat things below that, lower trophic levels. Trophic means feeding, lower feeding levels. These are eaten at lower levels here. And finally, the whole system is driven by plants that grow in the sunlight. They're so-called phytoplankton. Now, what happens is if you knock out one of these species, and it's not what they call a keystone species, what happens is if you examine the mathematics of typical ecosystems, is not much. So it's no big deal, one species. So it's sort of like if you're in a hot air balloon and there are these cables coming down and the cables have little wires inside them, and you decide to go snip one of those wires with your clippers, but what will happen to your hot air balloon? Nothing. So you say that was fun. Let's do another one. Snip another one. If you snip enough of the cable, pretty soon your hot air balloon isn't functioning very well. So the same thing works for an ecosystem. And I've examined thousands of different ecosystems in my career. And what you find out is if you get rid of half of the plant and animal species in just about every ecosystem that I've seen, is the ecosystem loses its ability to transfer a lot of energy from the phytoplankton up to the top level predator. And so it threatens the stability of the whole system. So basically this says that you can get rid of a few species and then, if you're lucky, no problems. But if you get rid of a half of them, you're going to have a serious problem. So if humanity, who would be the top level predator of the planet Earth, if we get rid of a half of the species that involve in our food supply, we basically are going to have a real serious problem keeping our population up. The population will dive. And on the way, that will cause wars, massive migration. It makes the problems of COVID look like, they're kind of like a learning exercise. So we really have to avoid this problem. The Presbyterian Church recognized this back in 2001 with a call to avoid to halt the mass extinction. Basically, it says the creator deliverer calls upon human communities to work with God to rectify the abuses whereby human impacts upon the earth are leading to a mass extinction of human species. This mass extinction would fundamentally alter and undermine the life and well-being of the human and other creatures that survive. It would rob all future generations of the gift of wholeness and diversity that God intends. So it's a big deal. A lot of other churches have signed on to this, and hopefully we will avoid the whole thing. So this is another note of goodness here. This is the COP21, or Conference of Parties, the UN Conference on Climate. This was the one done in Paris. And it's the first time that they had met like 20 times before that, where they basically could get any kind of serious climate agreement. And I think a part of that is due to the fact that the Pope Francis, wrote an encyclical on climate change, basically spelling out the details of how to fix it. And these people were thrilled that he was interested in that. And they went ahead and paid attention to it. And it was partially responsible for 195 nations signing up on an accord to fix the climate. So that would take care of the other 25% of the problem we talked about. So it's a historic agreement, but it's flawed. The basic agreement looks at the situation that we would have had, that business as usual, if we just continued not doing anything on climate, we would increase the temperature of the planet 8.1 degrees Fahrenheit. What they agreed to in Paris was to limit that to 6.3 degrees Fahrenheit. That would still be a disaster, but it's not as bad as 8.1. So one way I learned to look at things like that is through the lens of people in Washington. They basically would say that half a loaf is better than none, but this half isn't very good. So what happened is people worked on the sidelines to basically get this goal changed to effectively a goal of 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, or 1.5 degrees Celsius. And that's the goal that everyone's going towards now. So basically, to meet that goal, what we have to do is take a look at the emissions of CO2 and decrease them. So instead of going up on this curve here, we end up on this curve here. And basically it says if we get to a certain degree of CO2 reduction, we need to remove about 900 gigatons. And that's about 25 years of current emissions. So you have to say, well, is that possible? Can you do that sort of thing? It turns out there's a book that goes into that in great detail called Drawdown by Paul Hawkins. And he looks at about 100 different options for reducing CO2. And he basically shows that we could achieve that whole goal of 900 gigatons, and also in the process save $74 trillion. So you could meet the goal and use this money to improve your quality of life. So it's a wonderful kind of situation we're in. So if we do the right things, we not only save the bugs and bunnies of the planet. We save our own self, and we also increase our quality of life. So it's a nice kind of problem to have. We can do it through things like more photovoltaic capacity, solar plants. You can see back in 2007, there weren't essentially any plants here. And now in the world, we have enough plants. We're talking about like 750 gigawatts of plant. That's enough to replace 350 salmon ovaries, to give you some idea. So we're doing well. We need to do better, but we're certainly off to a good start. And a lot of folks have these on the roof and are very happy with the savings that they've gotten. So it's an example of where you can do things environmentally correctly and also do things in a way that are good for your pocketbook. So the spreadsheet in the book looks something like this. And if you basically go through it, you end up saving 1,000 gigatons just using this book. And there are a lot of other options in there. And we'll talk about these options later in a book called, one of the classes called Climate Change and Us. So you save the requirements for the Paris Accord here, and also you save 74 trillion bucks. So not a bad deal. So, why, by the way, you save the earth. So here we are in a strange situation. We're basically sort of like in the Garden of Eden situation. You know the Garden of Eden, there's this two naked people, there's an apple, a snake, some things occur, things don't work out well, and they make some bad choices. So today, we basically are in a situation where we can't make up our mind what to do. We have to decide, do we want to basically save that $74 trillion and live very nicely in terms of quality of life, or do we want to essentially wreck the planet in such a way that we won't be able to possibly live at all? So to summarize, is there any hope? Will we ever get sensible environmental policies? Some people say, not until hell freezes over. I just wanted you to keep in mind that this is the San Diego Union Tribune a few years ago, and it basically has a headline here that hell freezes over. So it is possible. So I'd like to conclude on a note of high philosophy here. This is Charlie Brown writing a letter to the editor. To the editor, I think it's time for all of us to be more positive. We must stop allowing others to speak for us. He gets excited here and he says, each of us needs to stand up and be counted. Sincerely, name withheld. So I hope and pray that you will not withhold your name from this very important set of issues. Thanks very much. And let's see if there are any more questions.
Oh, Tom, that's so great. We have a comment from Mary Dell that said Bill Gates just wrote a book on global warming.
Gates is basically saying the two things you want to go after in his playbook are steel, making new steel, and also the steel and cement. Those are the two big ones. And I couldn't remember, the details of the emissions inventory, so I wasn't sure whether that was a good choice or not. So I looked them up. Steel worldwide accounts for 8% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. So 8% is a big number. And cement, interestingly enough, turns out to also be 8%. So if you take 8% and 8%, Gates is basically pushing for strong efforts to reduce that 16% significantly. And so, yeah, I think he's got it right.
Have you seen Michael Moore's Planet of the Humans? And if so, how do you answer all the objections to environmentalism that Moore raises?
I normally like Michael Moore, a little bit of a hellraiser.
Right.
A lot of fun, but I thought that was the sad piece of work that he did there. I'm just thinking of the errors in there. I've forgotten all the details, but it was like, oh my God, how could he get it so wrong? So it's a sad kind of thing. I guess we could spend half an hour if we went through the details, but it was just like a pathetic movie.
Adrian asked, what about the amount of oxygen contributed by the rainforest?
Well, the rainforest contribute a lot of oxygen. They often talk about it as being the lungs of the planet, and they're a good part of the lungs. I mean, I would give the blue-green algae sort of a thumbs up also in the oceans. They do a lot of it. But yeah, you really need to protect the rainforest because those things, they affect the weather so much. And we're beginning to see that you can do some what they call terraforming in the rainforest and make it into a rain desert essentially. So it affects the climate. So it's one of those things. It's a global resource that you have to figure out how to make it so that people can make a lot of money there, so they have a good quality of life, but also how you can protect it as a global asset. So we're going to have to do a lot of that thinking. And most of the analysis that I've seen is like there's just a ton of ideas out there where you can essentially do both things simultaneously.
Robert asks, what is your response to people who say that anything manufactured now, like solar panels and electric cars, have too much fossil fuel embodied in their production to make a difference when the final accounting is done?
Aha! I say to Rob, I think he must have said this, Rob Coffin, I assume.
Yes.
I say, Rob, that's a good pitch for the upcoming talk called, what's it called? Energy Futures.
Oh, Energy Futures. That's on March 11th. Yeah.
March 11th. What we do is we go into a detailed comparison and show you how to do it so that you can do it yourself of 4 different types of ways of making electricity. One is a coal. One is, I think we use natural gas, nuke, and nuclear. And I think we do solar photovoltaic, just solar panels. So I think those are the 4. So we'll go into some details about how you can compare those things in terms of jobs, cost, emissions, and whatever. And to get an answer that makes any sense, you have to include more than just the power plant itself. You have to include the materials that went into making the plant, the materials that are used annually to keep the thing operating, the materials that are used to dispose of the plant whenever you're decommissioning it. So you have to do what we call a complete energy cycle analysis. So that's a plug for the future talk called Energy Futures.
All right, sounds exciting. I've been following Citizens Climate Lobby's focus on escalating carbon tax as the most efficient and fairest method to attack climate change, according to the majority of economists, both on the left and the right. Can you comment?
Yeah. Marshall Saunders, who was the founder of Citizens Climate Lobby and ran it for, I don't know, a dozen years or so before he died. Anyway, Marshall's a very good friend of mine. I don't know how many meals we've had together, but we would love to go out to, his favorite place for lunch was a Persian restaurant. So anyway, Marshall basically, that was his bag, focus on one thing like a laser beam. And I always said, well, look, Marshall, this is a great thing to do. I think you should do it, but it shouldn't be the only arrow in your quiver. Because you need a lot of different arrows in order to solve the problem. So I said, yeah, go for it. I think it's if you compare it with, say, fee and dividend, which is the current California approach, I think it's light years ahead of it. So much better than California because it's faster to do, it's cheaper to implement. That's been the problem with that approach where you basically put a price on a pollutant. Nixon first proposed that for SO2, but his buddies shot it down because they said it's just too effective. It makes change too quickly. So we wanted something slower. So we ended up after many years with the fee and dividend thing. Not the fee and dividend, the cap and trade. Cap and trade works, okay? It's just that it's costly and it takes a long time. we need something that's cheap and that's fast. So Marshall's plan works that way. But you have to do a lot of other things in addition to that. But I would certainly, as one of the starting places, I would push the fee and dividend very hard.
Okay, well, that's a good segue to a question from Christine that says, are there policies that metropolitan areas can adopt that will significantly reduce our carbon footprint?
Oh, yeah, yeah. Well, what happens is in order for policies to be implemented, you either have to give out a whole lot of money, which nobody has, or you have to do something which actually saves people money. An example would be like whenever we decided to put a 50% limit on garbage from both homes and industry. But in California, Byron Shear, who carried the thing, basically figured out that the people's not going to like that at first because it sounds scary to them, but the mayors all love it because it makes a 50% reduction in their costs of running their waste program. So what they can do is they can actually be saving money by doing this as opposed to spending money. So yeah, it became a very popular thing. So the same thing will happen if things like, suppose we have a decent mass transit system in San Diego instead of this train wreck that we have for a road system. We basically got our current road system by taking the old red car system, demolishing it, and building roads where the tracks used to be. Not a real smart thing. So what you need to do is figure out a way to do mass transit so that you build ways for people to get around easily. And so also so that they can get from where they live to these vehicles that take you somewhere else quickly. So that's why places like New York, Washington, Stockholm, Moscow, that's why they work, because they have solved the issue of where people live and where the mass transit systems are. Without those, they wouldn't work at all. So yeah, we have to do that. That's an example. But also we need to do things that are better than that. We need to do things that make people feel like they're living better. And I think we can do that. So better, cheaper, those sort of things are good.
Is there a national solar power grid in the future, in your opinion?
Well, it makes sense because, you know, the clouds get in the way of sunlight. And so if you want to smooth things out, you just do it over a bigger area. I think the thing that's driving solar these days is because you can build a solar system with battery storage for so the thing works at nighttime, you know, which these solar systems don't work real well at nighttime because there's no sun. So you can build a solar system with battery storage for less, significantly less than the price of putting in a new natural gas system. Now that's still a lot cheaper than coal or nuclear, okay? So basically solar and wind are gonna win on the concept of the cheapness of new stuff. Now you get into a problem of old stuff. How long should you run the old stuff? You know, keeping it put together with baling wire and chewing gum or whatever the technique is. So what happens is the economist would say, well, if you get to a place where it's cheaper to build and install the new stuff and operate it than it is to patch up the old stuff, you know, economically, it makes sense to basically shift to the new stuff. So I think something like 80% of new electrical power generation in the US is renewables today.
Wow.
I hope that begins the answer. That's a really complex question. And we'll get into that more with when we get to the business of looking at climate and us under the drawdown activities. We'll talk about other ways to do the same sort of thing.
Okay, and Adrian has a follow-on question, but first, Christine just sort of followed up to her question about policies in cities, saying perhaps we should be developing a blueprint for each city to become green cities in a way that is specific to the city. What do you think about that idea?
Well, I think that you're seeing that happen. San Diego was the first that I knew of in the world that had a decent climate action plan. a climate action plan says, I want to get these CO2 and other greenhouse gases down to a certain level by a certain time. And here's how you do it. You have to do this, that, and some other things, okay? And here's how you keep track of it so that it's just not all fairy dust. So you're making it a real management of the system. So San Diego did the best that I was aware of. And then everybody else started copying the San Diego plan.
So you're saying that happened, is what you're saying. You're starting to see that happen.
Yeah, it's already happening. Okay. And what's happening is they're not only copying the plan, but there are some problems with the plan. All plans have problems. And they're basically making better plans. So it's tough to stay number one.
Yep. Well, that's great for San Diego, for sure. Yeah. Adrian's asking, are there batteries now that store solar energy?
Yes, because this system that I was talking about, where like in Hawaii, where they put it in. In fact, there was a bid for the LA Department of Power and Water, where the bid came in basically half the price of natural gas for new solar panels, complete with batteries. So that's happening. That's not a thing that's going to happen in the future. That's today. Now, of course, the batteries of today are not the answer forever, because they basically I guess they sort of started from the batteries in computers, in portable computers. So what they're doing is they're finding out there are much more efficient ways to do that, to get more energy stored in a smaller volume and cheaper. So I think my wife thinks that if you have a kid that is looking for a career, go for batteries.
And we have a few more now questions. Robert's saying, was that 8,000 species per year statistic from the 2004 paper that you cited?
No, that's not from that paper, Rob. That's basically, that's one piece of the paper, that basically, it incorporates that. But basically the math comes from the basic chicken laying eggs example that I gave you. So if you follow that stream of mathematics, it's pretty simple. You end up with two linear equations and two unknowns. You just solve them. That's where that number comes from. But basically, okay, it's very similar to the numbers that you get. The Thomas et al. Work in 2004 would have similar numbers. The numbers that are coming out today tend to make my numbers a little bit too conservative. So if I made a mistake anywhere, it's on the side of predicting the numbers to be too small. In other words, the problem is worse than I'm telling you about.
It's inconceivable. I mean, the scale of that, it's not new to me, but I'm speechless. Do you ever meet people that, it has no effect on? Wouldn't this be a real party stopper anywhere?
Well, I basically learned what the issues were by going to a conference in Las Vegas at the Mandalay Hotel, nice place. And it was sponsored by the Cornwall Alliance and some other group. I've forgotten the name of the other group, but this was the big deniers conference, for the year. And this was like the 8th one or something like that. And so I'm going to spend 4 days with these guys. So all my buddies are asking me, are you going to ask them all kind of nasty questions? And I says, no. They said, what? Why the heck are you going there? I said, well, I just got to sit there and listen. Well, isn't that kind of stupid for you just to sit there and listen? I says, I don't know, maybe it is, but what I'm trying to accomplish is I'm trying to understand how they think.
Right.
And so, so basically, that if you understand how someone thinks, you can then talk to them.
I did the same thing. Calvin Beisner was here in Raleigh at a Orthodox Presbyterian parish, and very conservative. And I went to go hear the summit that day, all the speakers, and I had lunch with him at the table. And I didn't say anything, I just wanted to see them in their natural environment. Yeah.
So it really helps if there's a big issue to basically be able to sit down with people, have a beer, a glass of wine, whatever, and just listen to their points and
Yeah.
don't argue with them, but say, can we talk about any of these issues, And that way, I've seen a lot of people change positions.
Well, yeah, they have points. I mean, they have points. They have a different perspective, and some of it is very reasonable, Yeah.
James is asking, who is the author again of Drawdown?
What's his name? Hawkins, Paul Hawkins.
Paul Hawkins, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think there's two versions of Drawdown. It's Drawdown 1, first edition and second edition. Mine is the first edition, but if I were buying it again, I'd get the newer one.
Also,
it's
I
a
think,
beautiful book.
yes, I know. I have it, and yeah, it's really. I mean, it wakes you up on the issues, but also gives you some cause for optimism, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that as you might know, I think I'm a semi-realist. I've been responsible for solving a lot of problems in my day, and yet I tend to think of this as a very optimistic time. But I think it's a time of where the real issues are communications issues as opposed to technology. 10 years ago, I couldn't say that because, we didn't have the solar or wind, that battery capability, but nowadays we do. So it's really a matter of just being able to talk to each other, get a lot of agreement among people, and go forth and essentially get a better quality of life.
No, absolutely. I'd be curious as to your take on what's happening at Houston and in Texas right now with the grid and the power grid and everything.
The nation has 3 grids that basically supply electrical power. One is brilliantly called the Eastern Grid, which I don't know, goes to Chicago and places like that. And then there's a Western Grid, which goes to places other than Texas. And then there's the Texas Grid. Now, Texas does make some of the best beef on earth. So I think they have bragging rights on certain things. So I think they want to have bragging rights on their grid. But there are some advantages if you have your grid coupled to other grids. But you have to be careful. Like, for example, in the Northeast, what happened is there was a squirrel that ran across the transformer and got fried running across the transformer. And the frying of the squirrel led to the whole Northeast going out of electrical power. So you have to have some management discretion in there. But if you hooked up the Texas grid with the East grid and the West grid, and you have a problem there, they can help each other out. Like if they're having a problem with some area, they can isolate that problem and steal some electricity from the East and West. I think that's smarter than having one that isn't coupled. But that's just me. I think there may be a few people in Texas agreeing with me now.
Yeah, there was a good podcast on the Daily, the New York Times Daily, yesterday on this issue, talking about it. And so if anybody's interested, you might want to check that out. But it sounds like they opted to go for their own grid, partly because they're Texas and they like doing things on their own. But also there was some cost savings associated with doing that. And in that planning, just did not really anticipate the level of cold that was going to come that caused everybody to turn on their heat all at once, which apparently has triggered, that's according to triggered a lot of the outages. So they
I think
a matter of emergency planning.
The Texans should be making some phone calls to Becky's husband, Carl,
yeah,
to basically get some help in their thinking.
I would say that over here, Tom, in the Triangle in North Carolina, the 2 groups that have started up to creation care groups, they have used the drawdown book as like a core thing they want to push out to all the parishes and churches and what have you here. So they're on fire about that.
Well, it's a marvelous book. It just came out of nowhere, and just caught on, and they did it right. The thing I would add though is that in order for drawdown to make any sense, you need to have something in front of it, namely the Paris Accord, those curves I showed you.
Yeah, right.
And so you have to get some idea. The goals come from somewhere. And then you get into, okay, I have these 100 options. I'm particularly interested in some of the biological options because, you know, we basically haven't been pushing very hard at the problem of preserving the tropical rainforest. We've been pretty much ignoring that problem. So this gives you the drawdown book gives you some incentives to do biological things in the tropical rainforest. So I think that's a good thing. And I think the national program, though, should recognize that the real problem they have is twofold. You know, one is the temperature problem, which everybody's going after, but the other is the other half of that's the other component of extinction of species, 25% due to tropical rainforest. So, you know, if we're going to basically manage the planet, we need to do both of those things, and hopefully we're catching on. And books like Drawdown show you how to do that and also improve your quality of life.
Thanks.
But for all of us that have been on this call, I know we want to thank Dr. English for his awesome presentation, so informative. And thank you so much for this. And we really look forward to the next number of sessions. Next Thursday is on weird weather.
I think that title tells it all.
Yeah. And then we've got,
you know, we all know the weather is crazy, but
exactly.
What I'll do is I'll show you how to understand what's happening. And I don't see much of that. So I think the understanding will be a big thing, and it allows you to predict, you know, more reasons for making change quickly.
Great. And then followed the following week by climate change and us.
Yeah, that basically is a discussion of what are the options for fixing the problem. We now have a sort of a rule book that says, okay, we have to reduce so many tons of CO2 by a certain period of time. That's the Paris Accord. So, okay, what are the options for doing that? We'll be going into this book Drawdown and talking about those options and maybe a few other ones too.
And then followed by Energy Futures on March 11th.
Well, yeah, that basically gets into a comparison of different ways to skin a cat. So you can make electricity many ways. Let's look at a few. And it turns out that the answer, like in most sensible things, doesn't come out to be one size fits all. What happens, for example, if you want to use solar, you must have at least batteries. But if you combine solar with wind and batteries, it's even cheaper. So sometimes it's not just one thing, it's a few things.
And then the final three are going to be nuclear waste on the beach, which I'm sure is going to address our fun problem here at San Onofre, among other things, followed by the Pope, the Patriarch, and the Rabbi, which I'm sure has a lot of interesting discussion about their interest and the impact of you know, all the great belief systems on what's going on here. And then the final is going to be fate versus choice, COVID-19 and climate crisis.
Yeah, the basic, well, let's go back to the Patriarch one. The Pope, the Patriarch, and the Rabbi, it sounds like a joke, you know, the Pope,
Yeah.
the Patriarch, and the Rabbi went into a bar.
Walking the bar, right?
Yeah, so what I'll be talking about is the experience of those three different levels of religious hierarchy in terms of climate change and how important their contributions have been. You know, the Pope has 1.4 billion people. The Patriarch has about 1.4 billion. The Patriarch has about 400 million. And the Rabbi, at least this one I'm talking about, has maybe a couple thousand. So several different levels, and you can get the ideas of that. The one about the COVID is basically the COVID stuff that we've been going through is really tough, okay? Very hard, lots of deaths, you know, lots of different management strategies, some of them not too good. So basically the question is, can we learn anything from our COVID experience that will be applicable to the climate experience?
Absolutely. Well, they're all just awesome topics, and again, so informative. And thank you again for such a great presentation.
Okay, folks. Well, I've had fun. Thank you very much for all the interaction.
Absolutely. Thanks, everybody, and have a good rest of your week, and hopefully we'll see you next Thursday.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.